In the beginning, long before people turned their phones toward the world and tried to capture every small moment, long before fans watched interviews to search for tiny clues about their favorite actors, and long before anyone ever thought of Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock as symbols of humility and quiet strength, there was a single moment that almost changed everything. It was a soft, almost invisible moment, one that hid itself inside the noise of Hollywood during the late 90s, when everything was loud and fast and shiny. But if you looked closely, you would see that this small moment was the seed of a story that nobody ever expected. It was the kind of story that would later make people say, "I knew they were different," even though back then almost nobody sensed it. And that moment began on a day when two young actors, both exhausted, both unsure about their place in the world, stood under bright studio lights while pretending to smile for cameras they wished would disappear. What happened behind those cameras was something almost nobody heard about, something small yet powerful, and something that would tie their lives together in a way that still inspires people today. You might think you already know everything about them. You might think you have watched the movies, heard the interviews, and read the stories online about how kind they are, how respectful they are, and how humble they seem compared to the chaos around them. But the truth is, there is a deeper story, one that sits behind the scenes, shaped by quiet decisions, moments of hesitation, surprising turns, emotional wounds, and little gestures that almost never became public. This story is not about fame or awards or the glamorous parts that Hollywood likes to show. This story is about two people who found themselves inside a world built on ego, and somehow, against all odds, they chose to move through that world with kindness, patience, and a strange kind of unspoken understanding. It is a story with twists, doubts, and times when everything could have gone wrong, and the way it begins may surprise you. It starts on a warm afternoon during the early filming days of the movie that would eventually make them legendary. The air tasted like dust from the old studio lot, and the sun stretched shadows across the concrete ground. Extras moved back and forth carrying props, assistants yelled instructions, and someone kept losing a radio, which made the whole team laugh every time the static-filled voice tried to call for help. In the middle of this noise stood Keanu, leaning against a metal railing beside one of the fake buses the crew used for practice shots. He had that quiet look he often wore, the one people later described as calm or mysterious. But inside, he was tired. He had slept barely 4 hours the night before, and his mind felt heavy from the pressure of being young, talented, and expected to carry a major movie. No one ever told him directly, but he could feel it in every glance from producers and every tight smile from executives who wanted everything perfect. He did not show his anxiety, but it lived in him like a small shadow that followed him onto every set. Sandra arrived a few minutes later, rushing in with her hair half-tied and her script pages pressed against her chest. She had been practicing her lines in the car, repeating them out loud in the hope that speaking them enough times would silence the sudden doubt she felt about whether she was good enough for the role. She was rising in Hollywood then, but rising did not mean safe. Rising meant you could fall even faster. She carried that feeling with her everywhere, even when she smiled, even when she made everyone laugh, even when she seemed confident on camera. The truth was, she worried all the time. She worried about disappointing people. She worried about being misunderstood. She worried about not being strong enough to survive the pressure. But like Keanu, she kept those worries hidden. She believed that if she admitted them out loud, someone might decide she was too emotional or too much trouble to keep around. These two people, both quiet in their fears yet loud in their talent, stood only a few steps away from each other, unaware that the choices they made that day would shape their futures in ways they did not expect. The first time Sandra looked up and saw Keanu, she noticed something unusual. He was giving his full attention to a nervous young crew member who was trying to explain something about a safety harness. The crew member kept fumbling with the straps, but Keanu did not rush him or interrupt. Instead, he nodded, waited patiently, and spoke in a soft voice that seemed out of place among all the shouting around them. This was not normal behavior for a rising Hollywood star. Most actors, when stressed or overwhelmed, would snap or turn away or ask someone else to handle it. But Keanu stayed there, calm and present, making the crew member feel like he mattered. Sandra watched this, unsure why it affected her so deeply. Moments later, Keanu noticed Sandra standing nearby and smiled in a gentle way that made her feel unexpectedly seen. Not the superficial version of being seen, the kind that comes from cameras or compliments, but the kind that felt like someone recognized the real person hiding underneath the performance. She smiled back, and in that instant, neither of them knew how meaningful their connection would become. They only knew that something felt comfortable, something felt respectful, something felt real in a place where real was rare. However, this same connection would soon become a hidden source of tension they never expected. As filming continued, the producers grew worried that the movie might fail. The stunts were dangerous, the budget was stretching to its limits, and the early test footage had not impressed the executives. Pressure built in the air like an approaching storm. People whispered behind clipboards, rewrote scenes at the last minute, and made sudden decisions that left the cast confused. During this chaotic stretch, Keanu and Sandra were faced with a scene that became a turning point in ways they did not realize until years later. It was a stunt sequence involving a rapid braking maneuver on the bus. The stunt team had rehearsed it, but something about the timing felt off. Keanu sensed it immediately, and he quietly stepped aside to talk to one of the stunt coordinators. Sandra, too, felt uneasy, but she hesitated. She did not want to appear difficult or overly anxious. Actors who complained about stunts were often labeled weak or uncooperative, and she could not risk that reputation. Yet something in her gut told her the situation was unsafe. When the director called everyone back to position, Sandra took her mark inside the bus. She grabbed the metal bar beside her seat, trying to steady her breathing. Keanu stepped in a moment later, glancing at her with concern. He seemed ready to say something but paused. That pause was a small detail, but it would later become part of the mystery of how their relationship worked. He sensed fear before she spoke it. He recognized hesitation before she admitted it. And that day, that instinct became something more powerful. The bus jerked forward as the cameras rolled, and Sandra felt the vehicle wobble in a way that did not match their rehearsals. The sound of tires screeching filled the air. The stunt required the bus to slam on the brakes while keeping full control, but something about the angle felt wrong. Keanu grabbed Sandra's arm gently but firmly, steadying her. The bus tilted slightly, and for a moment it felt like everything might spin off course. The director yelled, "Hold!" and the crew rushed in. Sandra's heart pounded. She tried to hide it, but her hands shook as she released the metal bar. Keanu looked at her, not with judgment, not with fear, but with something else entirely. A quiet recognition. He whispered, "Are you okay?" She nodded, though she did not mean it. She did not want to appear fragile, but Keanu didn't look convinced. He turned toward the director and said in that same calm voice he used earlier with the crew member, "We need to adjust the timing." The director, stressed and frustrated, snapped back, saying they did not have time for adjustments. Keanu held firm, not with anger but with certainty. "It's not safe," he said. No loud tone, no ego, just truth. Silence filled the bus. Everyone stared. Sandra felt a rush of gratitude mixed with guilt. Part of her wished she had spoken up too. Part of her wondered if she had failed by staying quiet. But the stunt coordinator stepped in, agreed with Keanu, and made the director reconsider. After reviewing the footage, the director realized Keanu was right. The timing was off by half a second, and that small detail could have caused a serious injury. When the danger passed, Sandra and Keanu sat together on the edge of the set while the crew reset the equipment. The sun had started to drop behind the studio buildings, painting everything with soft golden light. The longest day of shooting was finally ending, but Sandra felt something inside her shifting. Something she did not want to look at too closely. Something she could not quite name yet. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu shrugged gently, as if what he did was nothing. Anyone would have done the same. Sandra knew that was not true. Many actors would have stayed quiet to keep the production moving. Many would have put their reputation above someone else's safety. But Keanu didn't operate like that, and she wondered if he even knew how rare that was. As they talked quietly, something unexpected happened. A producer walked by, overheard part of their conversation, and misinterpreted what he saw. He assumed Keanu and Sandra were forming a romantic bond. In Hollywood, a rumor like that could spread fast and cause problems. The producer worried it might distract them, worried it might change their chemistry on screen, worried it might shift the power dynamic. What he did next created a ripple effect that neither actor discovered until much later. He decided to test them. During the next scene, he made a sudden adjustment. He added a new moment in the script, one that required deeper emotional vulnerability from Sandra while keeping the tension high for Keanu. He wanted to observe how they interacted under emotional pressure. He wanted to see if they would break focus or slip out of character. He wanted to confirm whether the connection he sensed was real or if it was simply the result of the stressful day. Sandra and Keanu were blindsided by the change. The new scene required Sandra to express fear and exhaustion in a raw, personal way. Keanu had to comfort her while also delivering lines that revealed inner conflict. The challenge was enormous, especially after the near accident earlier. But something surprising happened. Instead of struggling, instead of freezing or stumbling or losing focus, they found themselves falling into the moment naturally, as if something about the day had unlocked an unexpected depth between them. As the cameras rolled, Sandra felt her voice shake for real, not because she was acting, but because the emotion flowing through her was genuine. She felt seen in a way she had not anticipated. Keanu, in turn, responded with tenderness and steady strength, offering a grounding energy that felt instinctive. The director watched the monitors with a stunned expression. The producer who had doubted them leaned forward, realizing he might have underestimated them. The scene ended and the entire set fell silent. The director whispered, "That was it, that was the moment." No one moved. Keanu and Sandra exchanged a confused, breathless glance. Something had shifted, and yet neither of them understood it. That moment became legendary in the editing room. It was the heartbeat of the film. It was the emotional center that carried the story forward. But more importantly, it was the hinge in their lives, the moment that would later spark rumors, questions, possibilities, and feelings neither actor wanted to admit publicly. And yet, just when everything seemed to be moving forward smoothly, something happened that neither of them expected. Something that would create doubt, confusion, and a misunderstanding that could have broken the fragile trust they had built. Because the producer who tested them wasn't finished experimenting. And the next decision he made would change everything. The test that went too far. The next morning, long before the sun rose over the wide concrete of the studio lot, something strange was already happening behind closed doors. The same producer who had watched Keanu and Sandra so closely the day before sat alone in his small office with a cup of cold coffee and a restless expression. He replayed the emotional scene from the previous shoot over and over, studying every detail like he was searching for a hidden message. He watched Sandra's trembling voice. He watched the quiet way Keanu steadied her. He watched the tension between them that felt too natural, too honest, too powerful to be simple acting. And with every replay, he convinced himself of something dangerous, that their connection was real, that it was growing fast, and that it might threaten the structure he needed to keep the production under control. In truth, he was wrong about almost everything. But he didn't know that, and his misunderstanding was about to send both actors into a spiral. He leaned back in his chair and muttered to himself, "This could change everything if I don't manage it." The problem wasn't their talent. Everyone already knew both of them were rising stars. The problem, at least in his mind, was that emotions had become unpredictable forces on set. He believed that if those emotions started to guide the actors instead of the script, the film could lose its shape. And so he made a decision that felt logical to him but would feel deeply unfair to everyone else. He decided to push them again, harder this time, to see how they handled emotional strain under even tighter pressure. He wanted to know for sure whether their connection was professional or personal. And to do that, he needed to break something, or at least bend it until it almost cracked. Hours later, when the cast and crew arrived on set, the day felt different. There was a nervous energy in the air, like the calm before an unexpected storm. Sandra walked toward the bus set with her script tucked under her arm, rehearsing lines she thought she would be filming that day. But the moment she stepped onto the lot, she noticed a group of people whispering around the director, who stood with his arms crossed tightly, looking uncomfortable in a way she couldn't explain. Keanu arrived around the same time, quietly greeting a few crew members before walking to the same spot Sandra was heading toward. When he reached her side, he gave her a soft smile, the same gentle expression he always used when he sensed someone was anxious. Sandra didn't tell him that her stomach had been twisting all morning. She didn't tell him she barely slept after replaying the near accident over and over in her head. But Keanu didn't need words. He noticed her tense shoulders and the way she held her script like she feared losing control of something. He wasn't wrong. Before either of them could ask what was happening, the director approached with a forced smile and said, "We've had a few changes." Sandra and Keanu exchanged a wary glance. Changes usually meant pressure. Changes usually meant someone higher up had become restless. The director, who liked both actors more than he admitted, seemed uneasy as he handed each of them a stack of new pages. "The producer thinks we should explore a deeper emotional layer today," he said carefully, like someone delivering bad news he didn't fully agree with. "It's a new scene, intense, we need it done today." Sandra flipped through the pages, her eyes widening as she read. The scene involved a moment of conflict between their characters, one that required raw vulnerability, anger, doubt, and a kind of emotional honesty that felt too real to be comfortable. It was the type of scene that demanded absolute trust between actors. but she and Keanu were still figuring out how to communicate, still learning how to read each other. Throwing that kind of emotional weight at them now felt reckless. Keanu read silently beside her, his expression tightening. He looked up at the director and asked, "When was this written?" The director hesitated for a few seconds too long. That told Keanu everything he needed to know. This wasn't planned. It was a reaction to yesterday. Sandra tried to stay calm, but the more she read, the more she realized the scene was crafted to push them to their limits. Her lines were filled with confessions and hidden fears, words that mirrored emotions she wasn't ready to confront, either on screen or off screen. Keanu's lines forced him to reveal internal conflict, guilt, and a protective instinct that felt dangerously close to how he instinctively behaved around her. The script almost blurred the line between performance and personal truth, and she wondered if that was intentional. She wondered if someone was trying to pull apart the developing connection she had barely begun to understand. She closed the script slowly and whispered, "Why would they add this now?" Keanu didn't answer right away. He stared at the pages, jaw tensing slightly, eyes darkening with a mix of concern and frustration. Finally, he said quietly, "Because they're watching." Sandra looked up at him with confusion, but Keanu didn't elaborate. He didn't want to worry her more. He simply handed the script back to the director and said, "Give us a few minutes." He turned and walked toward a quiet corner of the lot, and Sandra, after hesitating, followed him. They sat down on a metal crate behind one of the buses where no cameras or microphones were pointed at them. Sandra let out a breath she had been holding all morning. "Does this feel wrong to you?" she asked. Keanu nodded slowly. "They're pushing too hard, too fast. They think something's going on." Sandra felt a wave of heat rush through her chest. "Because of yesterday?" she asked. Keanu shrugged gently. "They think we're connected." He said the word softly, like it might break if spoken too loud. Sandra didn't know what to feel in that moment. Part of her felt embarrassed, part of her felt angry, part of her felt something she didn't want to name. "Are we?" she asked before she could stop herself. Keanu looked at her with surprise and a flicker of something she couldn't decipher, something deep and sincere. "I don't know yet," he whispered. "But whatever we are, we shouldn't let them control it." The weight of his words settled between them like a fragile truth. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the reality of their situation sink in. Then Keanu stood and took a slow breath. "We'll get through it," he said softly. "We'll protect each other." They walked back to the set together, carrying a quiet strength that formed not from romance, not from pressure, but from mutual respect and the growing understanding that they were allies in a world that demanded too much from them. The director called everyone into position. Cameras were set. The lights were adjusted. The crew fell silent. Sandra stepped into her mark inside the mock bus, gripping the back of one of the seats as she prepared for the emotionally heavy scene. Keanu took his place across from her, his expression composed but his eyes filled with something alert, protective, almost ready to fight for her if needed. The scene began, and immediately Sandra felt the emotional weight press against her chest. Her character was supposed to break down, admitting how scared and overwhelmed she was. Sandra delivered the lines with a trembling voice, letting her real exhaustion seep into the performance. The crew watched with stunned focus as she revealed layers of vulnerability nobody expected. But then came the twist. The new script required Keanu's character to respond not with comfort, but with anger and frustration, a sharp emotional shift that caught everyone, even Sandra, off guard. Sandra's eyes widened as Keanu stepped closer, voice rising with intensity. His lines cut deep in ways that mirrored real anxieties Sandra carried off-screen. She felt her heart pound harder. She knew he was acting, but the words felt too sharp, too close to something she feared inside herself. The pain she expressed in response wasn't scripted. It was real. Her breath hitched, and the camera captured it perfectly. The director watched with awe. The producer watched with satisfaction. But Sandra watched Keanu with a sense of confusion and hurt that wasn't supposed to exist in a controlled environment. The scene continued, twisting deeper into emotional conflict. Keanu pushed the intensity further, following the script, but with a conviction that made it feel real. Sandra responded with raw fear and frustration, not realizing that every emotion spilling out of her was being recorded and studied like data. When the scene finally ended, the air was thick with silence. Sandra stood frozen, breathing hard, unable to shake the unsettling feeling swirling inside her. Keanu lowered his head, hands slightly shaking, not from anger but from the emotional force he had been forced to channel. The director yelled, "Cut!" but the word felt distant, almost unreal. Sandra stepped back, avoiding eye contact with Keanu, unsure if she was more overwhelmed by the scene or the feeling that something between them had cracked. Keanu noticed immediately. He opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but before he could, the producer stepped in, clapping loudly and saying, "Perfect. Exactly what we needed." His voice was cheerful in a way that felt wrong. He looked at the actors like they were tools, not people who had just been pushed past their emotional limits. Keanu glared at him, something he almost never did. Sandra felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let anyone see how deeply shaken she was. She walked away with small, careful steps, fearing that if she moved too fast, she might fall apart completely. Keanu started to follow her, but the producer grabbed his shoulder and said, "Keanu, stay a moment. We need to talk." Keanu turned slowly, eyes narrowing. "About what?" he asked. The producer smiled smugly. "About her." Keanu froze, his expression shifting from confusion to anger. "She's not your experiment," he said quietly, voice low and dangerous. The producer smirked. "Everything on this set is an experiment." Keanu stepped closer, jaw clenched, voice firm. "You went too far." The producer shrugged, unfazed. "Maybe, but it worked. That scene will carry the whole movie. Good job, Keanu." Keanu stared at him, not saying another word. Then he pulled away and walked off the set, searching for Sandra. But Sandra was nowhere to be found. She had disappeared the moment she left the bus set, leaving behind only her script pages that had fallen to the ground. Keanu picked up one of the pages, his heart tightening as he realized the truth. She wasn't just upset. She was hurt, and the producer's test had broken her trust. What Keanu didn't know yet was that Sandra wasn't just hiding. She had overheard something she was never supposed to hear. Something that would change everything between them. The next morning arrived with a strange heaviness hanging over the studio lot, the kind of quiet tension that made everyone speak in softer tones without knowing why. The sky was pale and cloudy, and even the usual noise of crew members setting up equipment seemed muted, as if something had pulled the energy out of the air. Sandra arrived earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the pressure of running into anyone right away, especially Keanu. She hadn't slept much, and her eyes were still red from trying not to cry. She didn't want Keanu to see her hurt. She didn't want the producer to see that his manipulation had worked. And more than anything, she didn't want to explain what she overheard because the words still stung too deeply to say out loud. She made her way into her trailer, closing the door behind her and leaning against it as she took a long, steadying breath. She wished she could disappear into the small space for the rest of the day, but she knew she couldn't hide forever. The production needed her. The film needed her. And part of her, the part that still believed in professionalism even when her emotions felt like splintered glass inside her chest, knew she had to work. But before she could gather herself enough to begin, there was a soft knock at her door. Her heart jumped. She knew who it was. The knock was too gentle to belong to anyone else. She didn't answer, hoping he might think she wasn't inside. But after a moment of silence, Keanu spoke from the other side of the door, his voice low and careful, like he didn't want to scare her away. "Sandra, it's me. I just want to know if you're okay." She closed her eyes tightly, holding her breath. She felt torn. Part of her wanted to open the door and let him reassure her, to tell him everything she heard, to let him help her carry the weight that had been placed unfairly on her shoulders. But another part of her was afraid that if she opened that door, she would fall apart completely, and she couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not while the producer was still watching every move they made. She stayed silent. Keanu waited patiently, as if giving her time to decide. Then he said softly, "I'll be here when you're ready. I'm not going anywhere." She could hear the sincerity in his voice, the frustration too, not directed at her but at whatever had hurt her. She wanted to reach through the door and tell him that she trusted him, that she didn't blame him, that she was only trying to protect both of them from something far bigger than either of them realized. But the words stuck in her throat. Keanu waited another few seconds, then she heard his footsteps slowly fade away. The moment he was gone, her shoulders slumped forward, and she covered her face with her hands. She hated this distance. She hated that the producer had created a bitterness between them out of thin air, and she hated that she felt too vulnerable to fix it. While Sandra fought to gather herself, Keanu walked back toward the set with a deep sense of unease growing inside him. He knew something had happened, something serious, something bigger than a bad scene or a stressful day. He replayed every moment from the previous afternoon, searching for clues in the way Sandra looked at him, the way she walked away, the way she spoke. But nothing made sense. And the producer's smug expression the day before kept flashing in his mind like a warning he couldn't ignore. As the crew began setting up the next sequence, Keanu stood off to the side, trying to calm his thoughts. That was when he noticed someone unfamiliar walking across the lot. The man looked out of place. He wasn't dressed like crew or cast. He wore casual clothes, carried no equipment, and moved with purpose, scanning the area with eyes that were observant, focused, and not at all casual. Keanu frowned. Security was usually strict about letting outsiders wander the set. He approached a nearby assistant and quietly asked, "Do you know who that is?" The assistant shook her head, confused. "I thought he was with you." Keanu's concern sharpened. He kept his distance but followed the stranger's path with his eyes. The man stopped near one of the open warehouses, listening to something inside. His expression changed, surprise at first, then anger. Keanu moved closer, not enough to confront him, but enough to hear the faint rise of voices drifting from the warehouse. He recognized one of them immediately, the producer. His tone was sharp, annoyed, impatient. The same tone he used when manipulating people on set. Keanu couldn't make out all the words, but he caught fragments. "I told you to handle it. She's too sensitive. We need control." Keanu felt his stomach tense, but before he could step closer, the stranger slipped into the warehouse and Keanu froze. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong. He knew better than to walk into a situation blindly, especially when he didn't know who the stranger was, so he waited near the door, listening. Inside, the producer's voice dropped but remained irritated. "Why are you here? I told you not to come to set without calling." The stranger's voice was calm but firm. "Because you created a problem, and now I've heard enough to know you're making it worse." Keanu felt his pulse speed up. Who was this man, and what problem was he talking about? The producer hissed, "Keep your voice down if they hear." "They should hear," the stranger cut in. "She should know, she deserves to know." Keanu's eyes widened slightly. The only she involved in the producer's manipulations was Sandra. The producer snapped back. "No, absolutely not. If she finds out what we're doing, she'll walk off this film." "Then maybe she should," the stranger said coldly. Keanu stepped back, stunned. This wasn't just about emotional manipulation anymore. This was something bigger, deeper, more dangerous, and Sandra was at the center of it. He felt something fierce rise inside him, a protective anger he rarely allowed himself to feel. He clenched his fist at his side, trying to breathe through the tension building in his chest. Inside the warehouse, the stranger continued, "You told me you were keeping things under control. You didn't say you were breaking people." "Oh, stop being dramatic," the producer scoffed. "Actors break, they rebuild, they break again. It's part of the job." "No," the stranger said firmly, "not like this." Keanu could hear footsteps, loud and approaching the door. He slipped behind a stack of lighting boxes, hiding just in time as the door swung open. The stranger walked out first, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with frustration. He looked around as if searching for someone. Keanu stayed hidden, studying him carefully. Then the producer stormed out after him, grabbing the man's arm. "You can't interfere," the producer warned. "Stay out of it." The stranger tore his arm free. "She's my sister. I won't let you treat her like this." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. "Sister?" The stranger was Sandra's brother. Keanu watched the man storm away, disappearing behind a row of trailers. The producer sighed heavily, rubbing his forehead as if everything had become more complicated than he intended. He muttered something under his breath that Keanu couldn't hear, then headed back toward the main set with a forced smile plastered on his face. Keanu stayed hidden until he was sure the producer was gone. Then he stepped out, his mind racing. He didn't know what exactly the producer was hiding, but whatever it was, it involved Sandra's brother showing up unannounced, angry, and ready to expose something. Keanu felt a surge of determination swelling inside him. He needed to find Sandra. He needed to warn her. He needed to protect her before things got worse. But when he returned to the area near her trailer, he found the door open, swinging slightly in the wind. Sandra was gone again. And this time she wasn't alone. Her brother had found her first. The sky had shifted from pale gray to a deeper, heavier shade by the time Sandra left her trailer again, but she didn't notice. Her thoughts were too tangled, too raw, too noisy for the weather to matter. She walked with her arms wrapped around herself, trying to hold on to a sense of control that slipped farther away with every step. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in one place anymore because stillness made her think too much. And thinking hurt. Every time she tried to make sense of what she heard the day before, her mind returned to the producer's cold tone, his manipulation, his certainty that he could pull her apart piece by piece and rebuild her into something he could use. And then she thought of Keanu, who had only ever shown her patience and warmth, and she felt a sharp twist inside her chest, like her emotions were being pulled in opposite directions, and she no longer knew which direction was safe. She walked toward the ends of the lot, a quiet area where props from old productions were stored under faded tarps. It was a place where no one usually went unless they were looking for something forgotten. Sandra didn't expect anyone to find her there, which was why she jumped slightly when a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "You look like you're trying to disappear." She turned quickly, eyes widening as she saw her older brother, Daniel, stepping out from behind one of the large tarps. He looked almost exactly the same as he did the last time she saw him, tired eyes, worn shoulders, and that guarded expression he always wore when he was worried about her. She hadn't expected him to show up on set. In fact, she didn't even know he knew where she was filming. But there he was, standing in front of her, carrying the same quiet strength he had since they were kids. "Daniel," she whispered, shock overtaking her exhaustion, "what are you doing here?" He walked closer, his face softening as he looked at her. "I came because you didn't answer your phone again," he said, "and because someone needed to check on you." Sandra opened her mouth to protest, to say she was fine, but the look in Daniel's eyes made her swallow the lie before it formed. Daniel had always been able to see right through her. It was both comforting and terrifying. She lowered her gaze and asked quietly, "How did you even get onto the lot?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "I came through a side entrance. No one stopped me. People here are too distracted." His tone carried an edge Sandra couldn't ignore, and she realized he wasn't just worried, he was angry. She stepped closer, touching his arm gently. "Daniel, what's going on?" He hesitated, then he said, "I heard him." Sandra felt the air leave her lungs. "You heard who?" "The producer," Daniel answered. "I heard him talking. Actually, I heard a lot more than I ever wanted to." Sandra felt her legs weaken. She moved to sit on a nearby crate, needing stability before her emotions pulled her under again. Daniel sat beside her, watching her with concern. "What exactly did you hear?" she asked softly. Daniel looked away for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully, then he turned back to her. "I heard him say he was manipulating you, that he was using your fear, and that he wanted to keep you off balance so he could control your performance." Sandra closed her eyes, her jaw tightening. Hearing the words confirmed from someone else's mouth made them heavier, more real. Daniel continued, his voice growing more frustrated. "And that's not all. He talked about Keanu too. About using him to push you emotionally. About twisting whatever connection you two have into something he could exploit." Sandra swallowed hard, fighting the rising wave of hurt and anger. "Daniel, I don't know what to do. I feel like they're watching everything I do. Like every emotion I have is being used." Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice lowering. "Sandra, you shouldn't let anyone break you like this. You're stronger than that. You don't have to stay here. You can walk away." For a moment, the idea felt tempting. Just leave, just disappear, just escape from everything. But Sandra shook her head slowly. "I can't," she said. "This isn't just a job, this is my career, and if I walk away now, the story that comes out afterward won't be one I can control. They'll twist it. They'll say I was unprofessional. They'll make me look unstable, and then no one else will hire me." Daniel clenched his jaw, his frustration building. "So you're stuck here, letting them do this to you? You're too good for this industry if this is how it treats you." Sandra let out a shaky sigh. "That's the worst part, Daniel. I want to stay, I want to finish this movie, and I want to do it right." She paused, her voice softening further. "And I want to work with him." Daniel turned to her sharply. "With Keanu." She nodded, eyes dropping to the ground. "He's the only one who makes this feel less awful. He's kind. He listens. He tries to help even when he doesn't understand what's happening. And I pushed him away yesterday. I didn't want to, but I didn't know how to look him in the eye after what the producer said." Daniel's expression softened. "Did Keanu hurt you?" "No," Sandra said quickly. "Never, that's the thing. He's the one person who hasn't. I'm just scared that everything we do now is being watched, twisted, turned against us. I don't want to drag him into my mess." Daniel studied her for a long moment, his eyes softening in the way only family could manage. "You're not dragging him into anything. From what I saw today, he's already in it. He was looking for you, Sandra, worried, angry, protective. He's not going anywhere." Sandra felt her heart tighten both in fear and relief. She whispered, "I don't know how to fix any of this." Daniel reached out and took her hand gently. Maybe you start by telling the truth to someone who deserves to hear it." Before Sandra could respond, footsteps echoed nearby. She and Daniel turned toward the sound. Keanu stood a few yards away, breathless, eyes filled with worry, like he had been searching for her for hours. He took a cautious step forward when he saw Daniel sitting beside her. Keanu's voice was soft, almost tentative. "Am I interrupting?" Daniel shook his head and stood, looking Keanu directly in the eyes. "No, I was actually hoping you'd show up." Keanu looked uncertain, glancing between the two of them. "I've been trying to find you," he said to Sandra. "I wanted to make sure you're okay. You left so fast yesterday, and I didn't understand what happened." Sandra stood slowly, her hands trembling despite her attempt to steady herself. She looked at Keanu, realizing she could no longer hide from him, not when so much had already been twisted around them. "Keanu," she said quietly, "there's something you should know." Keanu stepped closer, his eyes full of concern. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." Daniel glanced at Sandra, giving her a silent nod that said, "This is the moment." So she took a breath, steadying her voice as she said, "I overheard the producer yesterday. He's been manipulating us. He's been using our emotions against us, and he's trying to push us in ways that aren't safe. I didn't know how to face you after hearing everything he said." Keanu's expression changed instantly, not with shock but with confirmation, like he had feared exactly this. He exhaled slowly, eyes darkening with quiet anger. "I knew something was wrong," he whispered. "I could feel it." Sandra took a step forward, tears filling her eyes. "I'm sorry I ran away. I didn't want to drag you into anything." Keanu shook his head firmly. "You're not dragging me anywhere. I'm already here." Daniel watched them silently, arms crossed, protective yet curious. Keanu turned slightly toward him. "You were talking to the producer earlier," Keanu said. "I heard part of it." Daniel nodded. "Then you know why I'm here." Keanu's eyes sharpened with determination. "We can't let him keep doing this. Not to her, not to anyone." Daniel stepped closer. "Then you need to be ready, because he's not going to stop. Men like him don't back down until someone forces them to." Keanu nodded slowly, absorbing the truth of Daniel's words. Sandra wiped her eyes, finding her voice again. "So what do we do now?" Before Daniel or Keanu could answer, a sudden shout came from the other side of the lot. It was one of the assistants, running toward them with panic in her voice. "You three need to come now. Something else happened on set." Keanu felt his heartbeat spike. "What happened?" The assistant shook her head out of breath. "There was an accident, a bad one." Sandra's face drained of color. "Who?" The assistant swallowed hard. "The producer." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "He's hurt badly, and the police are already asking questions." The three of them froze. And then the assistant said the part that made everything twist into something darker and more dangerous than before. "They think someone did it on purpose." The run back to the set felt longer than it truly was. Sandra's breath caught in her throat as she followed the assistant through the maze of trailers and equipment, her thoughts racing faster than her footsteps. Keanu stayed close behind her, his focus locked entirely on her, ready to catch her if her legs shook. Daniel kept pace too, his expression tight and protective as he scanned the lot, his instincts still sharp from the confrontation earlier. None of them spoke during the rush. There was no room for conversation, only worry, only confusion, only the heavy question holding itself inside all their chests: what happened? When they reached the cluster of emergency vehicles near the main set, the noise hit them first. Voices layered over each other, people talking in urgent tones, radios crackling, crew members standing off to the side with shocked expressions. Sandra felt her stomach twist as she took in the scene, but the first thing she noticed was that the paramedics weren't rushing. They were steady, controlled, not panicked. That small detail eased a fraction of her fear. If they weren't rushing, then maybe the producer wasn't as close to danger as she imagined. Keanu placed a gentle hand on her back, grounding her. Daniel stepped ahead to speak with the nearest crew member, who looked shaken but unharmed. "What happened?" Daniel asked firmly. The crew member pointed toward a lighting rig near the bus set. "The producer was standing under that. One of the clamps gave out. It fell a little, not enough to cause serious injury, thank God, but enough to knock him down. He's bruised, maybe sprained something, but the paramedics said he'll be okay." Sandra exhaled slowly, a shaky relief filling her lungs. Keanu closed his eyes briefly, letting go of a tension he didn't realize he had been carrying. Daniel's shoulders loosened, but only slightly. The danger had been smaller than the panic suggested, but the question still lingered in the air. Why did the police think it wasn't an accident? Two officers stood near the rig, speaking quietly as they examined the equipment. Sandra watched them, her pulse rising again, because she could tell by their focused expressions that they weren't treating this like a simple mishap. They were analyzing the details carefully, almost suspiciously. One officer crouched near the clamp, while the other spoke with a member of the lighting crew who looked nervous and confused. Keanu, always quiet but observant, noticed the tension and took a step closer to Sandra. "Stay behind me," he whispered gently. It wasn't a command, it was instinct. An officer approached the group, flipping open a small notebook. He spoke calmly, not accusatory, but with that steady tone meant to gather facts. "Are all three of you part of the cast?" he asked. Daniel stepped forward before Sandra could speak. "They are," he answered. "I'm family." The officer nodded. "We're asking everyone questions at the moment, nothing formal, just trying to understand what happened." Keanu nodded respectfully. "How's the producer?" The officer looked toward the paramedics. "Conscious, in pain but stable. We'll get his statement soon. Until then, we're asking if anyone saw something unusual before the equipment fell." Sandra exchanged a look with Daniel. She heard the thought he didn't say out loud. Unusual could mean anything. Unusual could mean them. Unusual could mean yesterday's argument. Unusual could mean overheard words, and she suddenly feared the truth might come out in the wrong way, twisted into something dark. Keanu sensed her panic and stepped in smoothly, his voice calm. "We just arrived," he said. "We didn't see anything." The officer nodded again, scribbling something down. "If you remember anything that might help, please let us know." The question hung in the air long after the officer walked away. Sandra felt Daniel's eyes on her, waiting for her reaction. She didn't want to get dragged into anything. She didn't want the producer's cruelty to turn into a story about sabotage or revenge. She wanted to stay clear of the darkness that had already seeped too close to her. She whispered, "I don't want to be part of this. I don't want any more chaos." Keanu placed a hand on her arm. "You won't have to be," he said. "This isn't about you or us." Daniel added quietly, "And it won't become about you unless he makes it." He nodded toward the producer, who was now sitting up on a stretcher, wincing as he spoke to paramedics. As if feeling their eyes, the producer looked over at the three of them. His expression was a strange blend of pain, frustration, and something else, guilt. He watched them longer than he should have, and something in his gaze softened almost imperceptibly. Maybe it was the shock of the accident. Maybe it was fear. Maybe, just maybe, it was the sudden realization that pushing people too far could create consequences he never intended. Moments later, he motioned for them to come closer. The paramedics hesitated, but he insisted. Sandra approached slowly, Keanu beside her, Daniel staying slightly behind, watching everything with the protective stare of someone who still didn't trust the situation. The producer looked at Sandra first. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally managed. "You heard me yesterday, didn't you?" Sandra's breath caught. Keanu stiffened slightly beside her. Daniel tensed. Sandra swallowed. "Yes," she admitted softly. The producer let out a sigh that sounded both weary and ashamed. "I shouldn't have said those things, not like that. I let pressure twist my judgment." He winced as he shifted on the stretcher. "It doesn't excuse anything, but today reminded me. Pushing people only leads to breaking sets, breaking schedules, breaking trust. I lost sight of that." Sandra studied his face, trying to decide if he meant it. There was something fragile in his expression, something that didn't look performative. Maybe the accident had startled him enough to shake loose some humility. Maybe for the first time he saw her not as an asset, but as a person. Keanu spoke gently but firmly. "We're here to work, not to be pulled apart." The producer nodded, closing his eyes. "You're right. I went too far. I'll step back and let the director handle the emotional direction from now on." Daniel folded his arms, not entirely persuaded. "Words are easy, actions matter." The producer opened his eyes again and nodded slowly. "I know." The paramedics signaled that it was time to take him to the waiting ambulance. As they rolled him away, Sandra felt a strange weight lift from her shoulders. Not forgiveness, not completely, but a weakening of the tension that had been suffocating her. Keanu stayed by her side as the crowd began to disperse. "You okay?" he asked softly. She nodded slowly. I think so, I just never wanted things to go this far. Daniel stepped in front of her, placing a hand on her shoulder. That's because you're a good person, but good people sometimes get dragged into storms they didn't create. What matters is how you walk out of them. Sandra breathed deeply. I don't want to walk out alone. Daniel smiled faintly. You're not. Keanu's voice joined quietly. And you won't be. Sandra looked between the two of them and felt the strength she had been missing return piece by piece. Not from being pushed, not from being controlled, but from being supported, respected, seen. The rest of the day moved slowly. Filming paused. The crew settled, relieved the injury wasn't serious. The tension thinned, replaced by a cautious calm. Eventually, Daniel left the lot, promising to return if she needed him. Sandra hugged him tightly, grateful beyond words. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the studio buildings and cast long orange shadows across the ground, Sandra and Keanu sat together on the steps of her trailer. There were no cameras, no producers, no interruptions. Just the two of them and the quiet hum of a cooling Hollywood day. Sandra spoke first, her voice soft. I'm sorry for pulling away. Keanu shook his head gently. You were overwhelmed, anyone would be. She looked down at her hands. I didn't want to lose the trust we were building. Keanu tilted his head slightly. You didn't. Sandra lifted her eyes to his. Even after everything. Keanu gave her a small, warm smile. Especially after everything. A slow peace settled between them, warm and real, built not from pressure but from mutual understanding. Sandra felt something unfold inside her, a quiet truth she had been too afraid to name until now. Keanu wasn't just someone she worked with. He was someone who made the chaos feel manageable. Someone who helped her breathe again. Someone who chose kindness even when the world didn't. They sat in silence for a long time, letting the moment shape itself without forcing it into something more. Neither of them needed grand declarations. Connection didn't always need loud words. Sometimes it grew quietly, like a soft flame that refused to go out. Finally, Sandra leaned her head gently against Keanu's shoulder. He didn't move away. He just relaxed beside her, letting their shared stillness speak louder than anything they could have said. And somewhere deep inside, Sandra realized something simple but powerful. They hadn't changed Hollywood by trying to. They changed it by being themselves. Respectful, humble, resilient, kind, and in a place known for noise and ego, that alone was revolutionary. It wasn't the stunts, or the fame, or the pressure that made their story unforgettable. It was the quiet, unplanned truth. That two people who never intended to be anything extraordinary ended up transforming the world around them simply by choosing compassion when others chose control. And though neither of them knew exactly what the future would bring, they knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, they would face it with strength. Together,